All right, friends, it's good to see you. We're starting this a little early. We're doing this from my house tonight, our Wednesday night Bible study. So it'll give me a chance to see if a few folks are logging on. So this is not on our church's webpage, unfortunately. We don't have really a way to do that from our houses. And just because of us needing to get some folks tested and different things, we can't be up at church tonight. And so here I am at home. Clint's going to do the choir thing, the choir practice as a Zoom meeting later. So you'll want to check into that. I appreciate you checking with me. If you're on YouTube, I probably won't be looking straight at this camera. So if you have Facebook, you probably get a better camera angle. But for whatever reason, I can't do Facebook on my computer. But I can't do both YouTube and Facebook on one device. So I have YouTube going here on my computer. And I never knew this was important until this pandemic, but my computer's camera is way down in the bottom left-hand corner, which makes for some of the weirdest camera angles for all of these video meetings that I've been doing. So I apologize for that. I hope it's not too distracting. If it is, you can join us over on Facebook if you're on Facebook. So if you're on Facebook or YouTube, glad you're joining us tonight. We're going to keep going with our Bible study on James. Just a couple of words of announcement is that this is the last one we'll do for a while. We're going to take the month of July off from our Wednesday night Bible studies. We've done that in the past in the summer. This year we kind of kept going because of all the strangeness, but we're going to take a little break in July and then pick it back up again in August. Just good news on all of those who've tested positive. Really, just two folks at our church who've tested positive. They're both doing very well on the road to recovery. In fact, one of them, as they visited with their doctor this week, thinks it might have been a false positive. We don't know that for sure, but there are some other reasons for perhaps thinking of that. So they're going to follow up on that. So that's all good news. We're still having to take some precautions just to make sure that we don't have anybody else on staff who maybe is positive at this point. And so several of us are getting tested and those kind of things. The safest course of action this week was just to postpone our in-person worship service for 2 weeks. That'll give us time to sort all this out. It'll also give us time to kind of watch the surge. We're starting to have our hospital systems ask us to reconsider in-person worship services for a while. And so our task force will have some time just to think through that thoughtfully and make good decisions. So tonight we're going to jump in. James chapter 3. I'm grateful for Pastor Davey filling in for me last week. I just needed a day off, so I asked for it. And then it turned out that John Curtis had a swim meet that night. So Davey covering helped me be able to go to John Curtis's swim meet, which was interesting, a socially distant swim meet. It went a lot faster because they didn't do the relay events and some of those things, which was kind of nice. But it was also fun to see the kids swim. So that was good. So here we go, James. And we're going to... Davey covered all of chapter 2 last week, he told me. And so we're going to pick it up in chapter 3. And we're going to skip verses 1 and 2 and really take the meat of the next section, which is his writing about tongues. So we're going to start verse 3. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so strong and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boast. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is also as a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body. It sets the whole course of one's life on fire and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. We'll stop there because I don't think we'll get through all of that. But James has powerful words here about the use of our words, the use of our tongue. He compares it to a fire, the ability of a small flame to create a great fire. The National Park Service tells us that 90% of forest fires in our country are started by human beings. The other are started usually by lightning, but 90%, that's amazing, isn't it? In 2005, a fire shut down Interstate 205 and threatened nearby homes in Vancouver, Washington. Investigators traced that fire to what a lot of fires start off as, of someone casting a cigarette outside of their car window. Fortunately, that fire was controlled before the damage got out of control, but that wasn't the case a few years ago when Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, someone put cigarette butts that were swept into a trash can. They ended up going into a trash chute, which set several dorms on fire and caused $20 million worth of damage. In that Vancouver fire, the fire chief, Jim Flaherty, really said probably what fire chiefs all across the country think all the time. He says, every car I've ever seen has an ashtray in it, so I don't understand what the thought process is. You just have to take a moment and think of other people. Isn't that a great line? Stop and think of other people. It really could serve as an excellent life motto, couldn't it? I mean, just every day we wake up and say to ourselves, stop and think of other people. Obviously, folks don't always think of other people or about anything at all, whether it's tossing their cigarette butts out of a small thing or the words we use. Just ask James. James knows that small things can do big damage to the family of God. I've seen this throughout my ministry. People leave the church more often than not because somebody has said something to them that has hurt them. Words seem like small things, don't they? Like a cigarette butt thrown out of a window, but they can cause so much damage to our reputation and to God's people. And James says, because of this, really our words and the way we use our words subjects us to God's judgment. And really, he wants the whole congregation to know this. He views the tongue as really one of the biggest problems in our life, really one of the most sinister sins. He calls it a deadly poison capable of corrupting the entire person. He says it's so dangerous that it can really set the entire course of a person's life on fire. And James really says, in this fire, where does it come from? I mean, he uses such strong language. It comes from the pit of hell. It's interesting, when we think of big sins, we think of murder and adultery. We think of theft. We don't always think of things like gossip or mean-spirited criticism or white lies. The sin of our tongue seems really small compared to so many other sins in life. And we think everybody does this. Everybody stretches the truth. Everybody spreads a little gossip. Everyone criticizes. And we think these are no big deal. But James, he thinks they are a huge deal. And he holds us in his gaze in his book and really wants us to know how dangerous our words can be. In verse 5, in the second half, he says, how great a forest is set on blaze by a small fire. Small fires can bring down small flame can eventually bring down a mighty forest, and small careless words can tear down a relationship. It can destroy a reputation. It can even split a congregation. James is often considered a wisdom teacher. Much like in the Old Testament, we have the book of Proverbs. Lots of scholars talk about how James has a similar feel. And this is a theme in both books. The book of Proverbs, we're reminded that gentle words are a tree of life, but a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. That's Proverbs 15:4. We know the power of words. How many of us at a low point in our life have had a friend speak an encouraging word at just the right moment? The right word can fill us with joy. It can help us to persevere. In the same way, how many of us have had a word tear us down? And even though it was a small word, a careless word, it sticks with us, doesn't it? I remember recently heard a pastor by someone who's really become a famous pastor, but back when I was a teenager, he was making the youth camp rounds, and he was the speaker at the very first youth camp that I got to go to when I was in the 7th grade. And during the course of the week, I ended up next to him at the Coke machine. And really, to me, as a little 7th grader, he seemed like a celebrity. The very fact that I would run into him in that place. And at first he asked me where my parents were, which was a funny question because I was at youth camp. My parents were not there. And I began to realize he didn't actually realize that I was a camper. It's like he thought I was somebody's little brother. Now, I've never been a big person, but I know in the 7th grade, I probably looked like I really was someone's little brother. That's fine. At the time, I wasn't overly sensitive about it. But when he finally asked me what grade I was in, and I said, I'm in the 7th grade, I'm a camper, he turned to me and he said, I thought 7th graders were bigger. Now, in hindsight, years later, I know he wasn't trying to be mean-spirited. I know that he probably wasn't trying to hurt me. But isn't it interesting that over 20 years later, really 30 years later probably, I can't remember one thing he said in a sermon, but I still remember those careless words that hurt my feelings. Again, he was not ill-intentioned, and yet it just shows us the power of words in our lives. Negative words stick with us. I'm sure you have a story like that too, where somebody's careless words have stuck with you through the years. It's just a reminder our words have power, even when we don't think they have power. So, heeding the fire chief's words, we should stop and think of other people before we speak. We don't always do that, do we, though? And James really says that when we fail to do this, it's because we have a basic lack of self-control. He says if we can't control our words, the truth is we don't have control over most of our lives. He compares our tongue to that of a rudder on a ship or a bridle on a horse. They're small things, but they harness great power. And at least they're supposed to harness great power. But if not controlled, they can lead to power that's run amok. Unchecked power, this is just the truth in life, unchecked power always leads to collateral damage. If something gets out of control, a power tool, or if a car somehow gets out of control without the driver being behind the wheel, there is going to be collateral damage. And James instinctively knows that. When we allow our words to get out of control, when we don't control them, there will be collateral damage. Mainly, we will hurt others and cause division in our relationships. We wonder, why is it that our words are so hard to control? I think it's because we are easily seduced by the promise of the power that words seem to provide. I mean, with our words, we can capture a crowd's attention. With our words, we can cut a foe down to size. With our words, we can build up walls that guard our vulnerable hearts from other people's attacks. All of this makes it tempting for us to use our words in harmful ways, even though we should know better. Proverbs 18:8 explains that few sins taste as sweet as the sins of the tongue. It says, the words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into our inmost parts. There's just something about hearing and sharing the inside scoop that makes us feel more alive, doesn't it? Makes us feel like we are a part of something special. Our pulse quickens, our ears are pricked. We feel a rush of adrenaline when we have the latest gossip to share, and that rush can be addictive. Ultimately, using words can make us feel powerful, especially if we feel powerless. Very often when we feel powerless, we use our words to strike out at others in power. And this gives us a sense of clout and control and might, but it does so at a very high cost. For such words, James says, they change our heart. That slander and gossip, it's easy to say these, I said something out of my character, for a moment, but James says if we repeatedly use these kinds of words, they corrupt our heart. In verse 6, he says they are a stain on the whole body. Another translation says that these words corrupt our souls. Whether we realize it or not, our mouths, our heart are hot-wired to our hearts. That Jesus said it this way, the good person out of the treasure of the heart produces good, but the evil person out of the evil treasured in their hearts produce evil. For it is out of the abundance of our heart that the mouth speaks. That's in Luke 6:45. If we're careless with our words, then it's because we are careless with our heart. This really runs contrary to the way we think about words most of the time, don't we? We think our words are extraneous to our life. That's perhaps because we live in a world where we have so many words. People talk all the time, and we think that we don't mean everything that we say, or we say something out of character. But James warns us, far from being fringe events or isolated events on the fringes of who we are, our speech reveals something about our hearts. Speak words of peace and forgiveness and grace, and you will grow in these characteristics. In fact, as we actively say things that speak the kindness of Christ and the love of Christ, we actually grow in Christ. But be warned, if you speak words of hate, of envy, of slander, and the like, your heart will grow heavier from the weight of such words. Proverbs 8:21 reminds us, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. The words you say, friends, they change your heart. It's interesting then, if we go very back to the cigarette butt cast out the window, it helps us to understand the truth that James is trying to teach. Yes, this cigarette butt, it tells us about the power of our words that tossed carelessly aside, it nevertheless can destroy relationships and congregations. But we know that the person who is casting aside a cigarette butt has done what first? They have smoked it. They have inhaled the poison into the very own lungs. They are destroying themselves even as their carelessness destroys others. James speaks about the power of our words in much the same way. It can hurt others, and it will destroy us. He says in verse 8, an untamed tongue is a restless evil full of deadly poison. It not only damages our relationship with others, it damages our own souls. So to borrow a phrase from the great theologian Smokey the Bear, if you refrain from words of evil, if you stop and think of others before you speak, the life you may save might be your own. Friends, it's been good to be with you today and tonight. Thanks for joining me here in my study at my house. I wish that we could be together. I know we will be someday in the future. Until that day, God will see us through. So it's been good to be with you again. If you are in choir or orchestra, Clint is going to be hosting you in a Zoom meeting later. You'll need to check your email for that link. God bless you. I'm praying for you. Please pray for me.